Before we get to the end of my summer series, I have to make sure we speak on one life path that has always been a huge part of my life. It's easy to gravitate to what we are most familiar with, but I'm discussing how you can create your own space and see beyond what seems like the obvious path. We venture to the other sides of Preacher right now on COP. Welcome to another chapter of Coleman on Purpose. Thank you so much for tuning in and coming back for another chapter from this summer series that I have going on the entire summer. We're almost at the end, actually, so it is one away from the end of our summer series, and oh, just wait till you see what I got lined up for the fall. Anyway, we are going to continue this week. We have gone through so many different topics, from teacher to singer to writer, and all of these different aspects that we've been through during this summer series. And it all has entailed with things that I wanted to do in life or thought was my purpose, different things like that. So we've gone through all of those, and now we're finally at a point where we're going to have a little church on today's podcast chapter. It's going to be a little churchy up in here because that is my root. That is where I come from. And, I am fresh out of church. So, I've always been involved with everything was always church to me. That's been my life. And as you know, from my very first chapter that I did on this podcast, it was called Church Boy Gone Bad. That should have let you know right then the direction of like what my life has entailed over time. And so I grew up basically in the church, as you well know. And I always say, I was born on the pew, and my parents were always heavily involved with church in general. So I've sat through many, 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 many sermons about many different topics, many different things, different denominations, everything you can name it. I've sat through many, many of sermons, and I can't even tell you how many sermons I've sat through. I can't even count them on one. I probably have sat through more sermons or teachings than the days that I've lived on this planet, when you think about it. Because let's break it down real quick. So I have been at services for Sunday service where we've gone more than once or twice in the same Sunday. So there were 2 or 3 services. So I sat through those, vacation Bible school, revivals, car rides when I've been riding with my family and they were playing messages, street ministry, YouTube. Nowadays you can watch sermons on YouTube. So I've watched sermons on YouTube even after I get home from church, or I rewatch a message from my pastor or another pastor that someone has told me to watch. So yeah, I've probably listened to more sermons than the days that I've been living on this planet, as I can think about it. And I still do attend church. I listen to teachings outside of the church every day. It helps me to grow. I don't just go to church and just stay there. I actually like to listen to other things outside of just being in church, because those are the things that keep me going. Those are the things that keep me energized. Those are the things that give me just a life. It gives me life, and I love that. And so naturally, as a child, I used to dress up as a pastor or a preacher, and I would wear my little robe and I would play church with just nobody there in my imaginary church, where I would have my fake congregation sitting there. We took communion. I used to tell them, okay, you're going to hell. You're not living right. So it was just a lot of screaming, a lot of yelling, a lot of back and forth. But I would always, I was a preacher at heart. That's what I thought that I really, loved to do. And it was just for play back then, but that's all that I knew. And everybody in my church had to be, saved and sanctified. So if you were not saved and sanctified, you needed to get out of my church. So I made sure that I had that. And I remember rolling up the little pieces of bread and having communion and all this stuff. I used to put them in the oven and toast the little pieces of bread. And that was my communion little wafers that we used to do. Yeah, very, very church. So I do realize nowadays, I used to think I was the only one that did that stuff. But then around, it may have been junior high, high school, when an album came out from Out of Eden. If you go back and listen to the very first chapter that I did this season, it was with Lisa Kimmy Winans, and on this album it was called More Than You Know. And if you listen, there are hidden tracks on the CD. Like, I'll be breaking down Out of Eden CDs like that. Like, I know where all the hidden, everything that's within an Out of Eden album, I know where it's at. So on these albums, there was like hidden tracks so that you'd think the album was over, and then it would go a little bit further. And on the back of one of the albums, More Than You Know, there was, I don't know if it was, I know it was probably not Andrea, or Andrea. It was probably either Lisa or Danielle that was doing this preaching at the end of this album. And she was doing a whole sermon and letting people know about their lives and getting saved and all of that. It might have been Danielle. I'm not sure. If anyone can clear this up for me, or Lisa, if you could clear this up for me and let me know who was that was preaching on the More Than You Know album. If anybody knows this, let me know. But it made me feel like, oh my gosh, I'm not the only one out here that's been preaching for fun and playing make believe as a preacher. So I used to love doing that. And so after we moved to Ohio, my dad started pastoring, as you know from my previous chapters, and I used to hear him preach all of the time. And to me, my dad is a natural preacher. And what I mean by that, by a natural preacher, he has all, or he's a natural pastor. Let me not just say just a preacher, but a pastor also. He's a natural preacher and pastor. He has all of the different elements that come with the compassion, the caring. He knows his stuff, like from back to front. Like, he has studied this stuff. He has, he can break down the Bible in so many different ways, and you'll just be sitting there looking like, oh my gosh. Okay, that makes sense. So I go to my dad a lot of times, I'll ask him questions and different things like that because of the wisdom that he's had from pastoring and doing different things. I just go to him, and it's a blessing to have him there, that there's somebody that I can go and I can really communicate with and talk with about different things. It really, really, that makes a difference. And so as time went on, and my dad began to, he was pastoring and doing all of these things, I started to notice there was a breakdown of the church at the time, and everybody wanted to be in front of the pulpit. And there have been so many more avenues that we've had with church now, from, there's not a lot of, singing and acting or singing is still around, but everything reminds me of concerts now. Back in the 90s, we had things like mimes, and those were things that I wanted to be more involved with, besides what my dad was doing, which was pastoring. I wanted to be involved with, like, the mime group. I wanted to be in the plays. I wanted to be singing on the praise team. Like, I wanted to do everything artistically. But the new modern church movement has made it very hard. And I'm not going to say every single church in the world is doing that, but there are quite a few churches now that if you go into churches now, you don't really find churches that have a lot of the arts involved in their ministries. And that's not always good to me. I feel like the arts ushers in the spirit of God a lot of times into the church, also praise and worship. But I do believe that there's a lot of breakthroughs that can happen through different artistic expressions as well. But I do believe a lot of that has kind of been, it's been eaten away at. And I will say that probably because churches are more involved with how they can stay open, and maybe plays and arts weren't bringing in the money to the churches and stuff like that. But I really believe in ministry. So I believe that in church, ministry does come through the arts as well. So I do love churches that still embrace that, or still have the flag ministry, or have different things going on that are still artistic in nature at the church. So when I got into college, I was still very heavily ministry involved. And during that time, after serving on the praise team and doing a lot of different things, I did eventually become a minister while I was in Toledo, Ohio. And I had the paper. I did a couple of sermons, and I was, or I'm going to get to this part, I still am, I guess, a minister. And so I was in therapy a while back, and I never used to be able to say that I am a minister still. I felt funny saying it because I've been not really in and out of church, but I've still been involved in church, but not as much of like ministry that you would think of preaching in front of people. Like when I first came over to my church here in Charlotte, Elevation, I began working with the children's ministry, and I was still I guess a kids minister in some type way, shape, or form, but I work with kids. So that was a form of my ministry at that time, but it wasn't the same ministry as I was used to seeing. Like I was used to seeing a minister is usually up in the front on the pulpit preaching or teaching, but I'm finding that there are many different ways that you can minister. But I can definitely remember myself, during these times, and being able to look back on it now and talk about it in therapy, saying that I'm not a minister anymore. And that really doesn't make sense because, yes, minister, you are ordained and everything like that, which I was, but I still can see myself in the light of ministry. So this therapist told me I am still a minister, even though I don't want to maybe claim it or feel like I'm not. Somebody at that time saw something in me at that time that qualified me, that they saw the ministry within me. And that's all that matters. And that's what they were basically trying to explain to me at the time, that it doesn't matter if you're not functioning in it or doing anything, but little by little you notice that you are ministering in little ways and forms. So um it is definitely what I chose to do with the purpose that someone saw in me. It all comes down to what someone saw in me, and it's what I choose to do with what they saw in me. That's really what I want to say. It's what they see in me, but it's what I choose for everyone else to see when I am projecting or ministering to others. Now, do I see myself pastoring? No, not really. I used to say, "Oh no, 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 no." Now it's now like, okay, maybe not really. I feel like sometimes the things that hinder me from wanting to pastor is, like I'm saying, there are too many things that are crazy about my life. Um, and we have one more chapter to do that I'm basically going to talk about, the real deal of the crazy things that I feel like are in my life, which maybe not that crazy to a lot of people, but um, I have always looked at my life as not good enough to be a pastor. Now, I did read a book that I put down here today. And if you always notice on my table here, I always switch up my books. I might have some of the same ones showing sometimes, but I try to switch up the books to kind of the theme of everything. And there's a book down here by Stephen Furtick, my pastor, that it was called Unqualified. And I always thought until I read that book that I was unqualified to ever pastor or to ever minister or to ever function in places in the church, because for one, I had divorced at that time, and there were a lot of different things that I dealt with that I'm going to definitely talk about within the next couple of chapters of my podcast, that I always felt held me back from doing those type of things that involve church. Another reason why I never saw myself being a pastor is because pastors have a shepherding nature. The career that I have now, that I've chosen, has made me very recluse. I kind of stay back and don't want to be around people a lot. I still have a few friends, but I do like time to myself. I'm liking it a lot more now, or time in front of the camera, or time creating, which I'm doing less and less of because I'm trying to be more social. I am trying to do a little bit more, be a little bit more out and doing things, but this job makes you very recluse because you're around people all the time. You are seeing over 500 to 600 people a day, like exclusively on a plane. And once you get off that plane, you don't want to see nobody. Like, I commend people that can still get off of a trip, or they can fly or do whatever and go out and be a social butterfly. That is definitely not me. I just want a little bit of time to myself, or go to a movie, or go do something that makes my mind lighter. Those are usually the things that I like to do. So it's a lot different than what I used to be like before I got this job. So no, I don't have that shepherding nature to me when I look at some of the things that I'm doing right now. Like, I don't feel like I have that in me. I think sometimes outside of my career right now, if I was more active in the church, I could maybe pastor a group of people or something like that, I'll never say never that I don't want to pastor, but I am unable to see that right now in my life. I will say the ministry still lives in me. It's a part of me. It's part of what I like to see myself as. I always joke with a friend of mine back in the day about how my first season of this show, and even some of my second season of this podcast, some of my current topics sound like sermon titles. Think back. Let's take it back a little bit. The fight to be heard. You are not a placeholder. Survival of the fittest. New season, same purpose. Released for a reason. Like, those sound like something that one of the pastors would say on a Sunday morning service or something like that. And you see, it sounds like a sermon. And I joked about it because I'm like, there's ministry that's always going to be inside of me. It's just built into me. And that's the crazy part about everything like that. And so I've always tried my best to sound, when I'm talking to people, non-preachy. That's why I feel like this podcast is so different for me, because I'm speaking like how I usually think. And a lot of times back in the day, I would kind of change around how I talk to people because I didn't want to come off very judgy or preachy or whatever like that. And then I found a balance, because I used to be super judgy and now I'm not as judgy, or I'm not really judgy at all. And that's the crazy part, because you don't have to judge anybody, but you can live by your own morals and standards of what you believe. I do believe everybody should live by what their moral or their standard is, or what they feel like. You shouldn't put anybody down for that, but I feel like you have the right to do that for yourself. And so a lot of times I would try to come off non-preachy, or I would talk in a different way, or I try to change myself around. But this podcast actually gives me an opportunity to really express myself in the way that I want to express myself. And I can still really give out what I believe and my root of faith and everything like that, without being, judgmental or making anybody feel some type of way because of just my expression or what I want to share with the world. And so that's what I really, really, truly do love about this podcast. I have been around preachers so long, and I understand that it is the preacher's responsibility to help steer you on a course that leads you to greater wisdom and your undeniable purpose in life. I do understand the purpose of a pastor or preacher is to do that for you, but I believe the reason maybe that I've not seen myself as a preacher all the time is because I'm learning by experience that my words hold value, and I would never want to give out words that would affect the way that you need to experience life, or I wouldn't want to be in the way of altering the course or the road that God wants you to walk down by giving you my own words or my own feelings. Yes, I can tell you about my experiences, but I would never want to make you walk down a different path just because of what I'm saying. And I talk about this all the time. I want you to be able to give something to the next person by your experience. So although I do agree sometimes that as parents, they're trying to set you on an example or steer you in the right direction by giving you some of their wisdom. You can take that or leave that as a young adult. You can take that or leave that, or walk down your own path once you get out of their house. Or you can take some of those bits and pieces with you and move on into your life with those things. I do believe, just like parents do that, pastors are placed in this world in order to do that for you also. Not everybody wants to always go to a pastor. I understand other people want to go to other people that guide them, but I know that in this life, you're always going to try to find somebody that guides you. It doesn't matter if you say you're doing this all alone. No, there are still little bits and pieces of something that someone is giving you every single day that is helping to steer you, or to put that little nugget in your mind that is making you be like, okay, I might go that direction, or that seems like something right. I just happen to go to a pastor for that because it aligns with some of my morals and some of my values and some of how I believe in my faith. That's why I use that as a method, and it has worked for me in many ways. Now, there are many times where I can look back at some things that I probably should have taken all that in and been like, okay, I'm gonna put this to the side because this doesn't totally align with everything that I'm learning and I'm experiencing in my life. But that's something that we don't learn until we get a little bit older. as children or as youth, as young people, we take in a lot of different things and we just take it as gold. But we begin to challenge those things in our minds sometimes to start to think through it, like, is that logic with what I've seen or what I've experienced or some of the things that I have gone through? Does that line up with that? Am I sure about that? So we begin to like reason with those things and figure out what we want to what it looks like to us in life. And so I will say that's what many people do. Not everybody subscribes to going to church all the time. I just know that brings me joy. That is what brings the greatness out in me. Those are things that I hold very near and dear to my heart. So I have definitely tried a couple of different roads in my journey, and I am liking the journey that I am on right now. There's one thing that I will say, even on this journey, that has never been unwavering for me, though, that I heard my pastor say this past week in church, that it's too late to convince me that Jesus is not real to me. The chapter that I started this podcast with alone, or the chapter after I started this podcast, after I talked about church and everything, where I was talking about survival of the fittest, where I talked about what I've been through, it lets me stand in believing and knowing that Jesus does help me, or Christ is there for me to give me that boost of faith and those things that I need in order to sustain me. And he's the person that sustained me, even when I was at my lowest, even when I lost a lot of friends, even when I was really in a crazy, crazy place. It let me know that, wow, this is not fake. This is real. I really had praying people that were around me. There was no fickle people that were around me when I was sitting in the hospital bed, and I didn't think I was going to come out of that. If you get a chance, if you skipped over chapters with this podcast, please make sure you go back to chapter 2, Survival of the Fittest, where I actually tell my story about going through my seizure, my traumatic brain injury, and stuff like that. That was a very intense chapter to me because that was a pivotal time in my life that I could only talk from what I remember. So I want you to go back and go check that out. So even though I don't see myself in the preacher role right now, I still have a need of telling people about my journey and how it's led me to where I am. But also, I like to let them know that before I started looking at my life's purposes, I had to understand the reasons why my beliefs and values were important to me and why I always want everything I do to center back to my faith in God. And I've seen countless and numerous examples of people that aren't necessarily behind the pulpit, but they make some of the biggest impacts in our natural world today. And as I say, I always have a story to tell about this because recently, as I was writing the notes to this chapter, I experienced something at a doctor's office. Go get this. First time visiting this doctor, I had to go in for something so I could make sure everything was secure for me. So I went in to see this doctor so he could get me together with my body. And we end up going to do some x-rays, and the doctor begins to really let me know about, his faith and his belief, because we were talking about these things and we were communicating and we were really getting into some things. And when he let me know about that at that time, I was like, man, there is no way that this was not aligned by God. I was like, I can't believe I'm actually sitting here and he is imparting something into me that if I had not even chosen this doctor or come to this doctor, we wouldn't have even have met. But it was set up divinely. I look at these divine things like, oh, and he let me know, like, I'm on the right track. I'm doing some of the right things. It's like those times when I feel like I'm out here on a limb, there are answers that I'm given at that time that let me know, God, you have me on the right track. You're doing what you have to do and that you are real. You are present. It's these little things. I could think about all these crazy times, even this past time. I don't know if I told you about this on a previous episode, but my pastor, I had never met him before. And it's so funny. Like, I had been going through like these routines in my mind. Like, I'm about to get out of this church. Cause like, it's too small. Elevation's too big and I want to go to a much smaller church. And I was just like, you know what? Let me start looking for other places. And I was like, I've never even met Pastor Ferdy before, ever. And all of a sudden, one of the flight attendants records a video of a flight that she had with my pastor, and he does a special, says my name and everything on the video, and like he hopes to meet me someday. And I mean, I know that doesn't mean a lot to everybody because you're like, oh, he's just a pastor. No, but somebody that I've listened to for 12 years that I'm like, man, I haven't even met this person, but he encourages me, he keeps me going, and there's these, he imparts to like read the word and to get into the things that I need to do in order to maintain my relationship with Christ in this crazy world. And so when I listen to him on here and talking and saying, hope to meet you someday, like it just connected with me at that time. And I was like, maybe for this season, I might still be in the right place, because for this to happen, and this person, we're not even on a communication level like that all the time, but I had posted something like, oh, wow, that's my church. And for her to like point that out, it really meant a lot to me. And I was like, it's the way that things align sometimes that let me know that even though I might not be a preacher, even though I might not be, a pastor, God can use anybody. It doesn't matter if you're standing in front of a pulpit or you're behind the pulpit. There is always going to be these people that are out here that are listening to the voice of God and listening to the things that they're in tune with, and just speaking from their heart and just learning these things that they've had instilled in them all this time, and that they're just implanting into me, and I'm able to go and take that information and better myself and go implant into other people. So we are still ministering in many different ways, and we don't even realize that every single day. I always go by the model to be an example, so that what others see in you, they are drawn to and they want to be a part of. I know that I'm not there yet, so I still have so much work left to do. But I know that I'm every single day trying, and people are just coming out of nowhere and letting me know you're on the right path. It's those little things when you know that you're doing everything that you're doing and you're on the right path that keeps you going, keeps you on your journey, and keeps you moving forward. Purpose never requires you to be perfect. It just requires a willingness and an openness to authentically walk into the original version of you that recalls that thing, that one little thing that's inside of you that energizes your entire being and fills you with so much that you have nothing left to do but to pour back out the abundance of that gift or those gifts that live inside of you. So I just wanted to say that before I stop this chapter, because I know we've gotten a little bit churchy today, but there is nothing wrong with expressing what brings you joy, what brings you happiness, what brings you peace, what brings your encouragement, which brings you up when you're down. There's nothing wrong with letting or tapping into that or letting somebody know those little things. And even though I may not be a preacher, I can still, which I say back in the old day in church, I can still testify and let y'all know what I hold dear to my heart. And that's what I wanted to say today on this chapter of Coleman on Purpose Preacher. I want to let you know that you can always follow me on Instagram at DeluxeDave, DeluxeDave. I am also on Coleman on Purpose on Instagram. You can go to ColemanPurpose. You can follow me on there as well, where I post other videos from Coleman on Purpose. It's all the Coleman on Purpose stuff, nothing extra of all of my day-to-day life. But if you want me, that's Deluxe Dave. Coleman on Purpose is going to give you directly the podcast. I'm also on TikTok at David J. Coleman, DAVIDJ.Coleman, or you can follow Coleman on Purpose on TikTok as well. I want to thank you so much for joining me for this chapter of Coleman on Purpose. Make sure you tune in for the final chapter or part 6 of my summer series next time. Please remember, you are unique, you are loved, and you are created for greatness. Till next time, holla.